Hello and welcome to Choice Conversations. I'm your host, Chris Stefanik. Today I'm continuing the series on the Fall of Stefan Molyneux, taking a hard look at immigration. So of course that means I've got my trusty co-host with me today, Wes Bertrand. Wes, welcome back.
Hola, amigo. Hola. Nice to be on the show again, Chris.
Yeah, it's great to have you. And we've got a special guest with us today. I have with me the author of Immigration, Individual versus National Borders, David Hathaway. David, welcome to Choice Conversations.
Good to talk to you guys. Hi, Chris, and hi, Wes.
Hey there. You know, I first heard about this book advertised on Free Talk Live. They did an ad on there about it, and I was like, wow, that's really, really well done. And I think Scott and Horton might have mentioned it on his show with Jeffrey Tucker on Empire.
Yeah, Scott actually wrote the foreword for this book. Scott and I have very compatible viewpoints on this, and actually Will Grigg, who writes a lot of things against the abuses of the police state, he actually wrote the back cover for the book. So I was very happy to get two prominent individuals to write little blurbs for my book.
Nice.
So David, why don't you tell the audience, tell Wes and I, what led to you writing this book? You know, what were your experiences that said, I really need to write this book?
Okay, not to undersell the book too much, but it really is a niche book. It's really written for libertarians who have seen inconsistency within the libertarian community on the subject of immigration. And what is a principled position on any subject, whether it's immigration or welfare or public education or public health? What would be a principled position? It would basically be that we oppose statism in any area. All taxation is theft. All taxation, since it is theft, it is also using force. And anything that is supported by taxation is using force and coercion to implement that program. Like I said, whether it's whether you're talking about public education or hiring border patrol agents, you are telling the public we're going to extract wealth from you to support this function in society. Now, I have been always very impressed with the writings of Murray Rothbard and Hans Hermann Hoppe, two of my favorite writers. And I've loved everything they've written except on the subject of immigration. For some reason, they have adopted a nation-state advocating position on immigration, where they have supported the idea of national immigration controls and putting people on the border to prevent private people from interacting with each other. And I think and I saw this as an inconsistency and a very odd position, because I've studied Austrian economics very much in depth. I was kind of brought into this realm by Ron Paul, reading things that Ron Paul wrote, and then I found more about the people who had written about this, Ludwig von Mises, Karl Menger, Murray Rothbard, Hans Hermann Hoppe. I got into all the writings of these people. So, one of the principles of Austrian economics is that only individuals take action. Any talk about society is meaningless. As a matter of fact, I have a quote in front of me right now from Hoppe himself saying, any talk about society is meaningless. Only individuals act and have values. So they have been always against, Austrian economists are against the idea of groups or society acting in unison, because there are always dissenting individuals in groups. So when they started saying that a whole nation could decide to exclude a category of people from coming into that nation, alarm bells went off in my head, like, you're now prescribing action for a whole nation, for a whole group, rather than talking about the individual. And as a matter of fact, other older libertarian writers like Frederick Bastiat said the exact same thing. Frederick Bastiat said, socialist writers have always tried to define groups and to define group action, and like the idea of groups acting in unison rather than individuals. So to answer your question, Chris, the thing that got me interested in this, it seemed very inconsistent. If you have a science, Austrian economics, which Hoppe and Rothbard are both Austrian economists, and the whole science of Austrian economics says that only individuals act, and you can describe what they've done after they have acted, but you can't prescribe for them what they should do in the future. And you cannot talk about society as a whole, what it should do. And I saw this as being inconsistent, that they have jumped past the individual and started to prescribe group action. And if I could just use a little anecdote, a little example, like let's say you own private property. You, as an individual private property, have the absolute right to exclude anybody you want from coming onto your property, or to invite anybody you want to come onto your property. And in my case, I have property right near the international border with Mexico. Why can I not invite somebody I want to come over to work on my land, or to have a party or a barbecue? Why cannot I invite them onto my land? Why is this other supreme entity that has created another border around my border, let's call that entity Darth Vader, just to be facetious? Why is there a right for another entity to put another super border around the border to my property to prevent me from inviting whoever I want? You can call that entity society or the nation or Darth Vader or whoever you want to call them. Why does anyone else have a larger right over my property borders of who I invite or who I exclude? Why is it not up to the individual? So anyway, that's kind of a long-winded answer, but those inconsistencies is kind of what got me onto this topic.
You're right. I agree with you. I find the whole immigration thing that, it's in the news right now because of Donald Trump primarily. He's really brought it into national focus. But I find it, it's very, very collectivistic. It's all of the thoughts behind it. If you want to take the principled stance, how can I as an individual, removing collectives, how can I as an individual tell another individual they don't have the right to move unless they're trying to move onto my land, my property?
Because collectivism, because government, right? These mythologies that we have.
I mean, it doesn't matter whether they're somebody who is coming from Mexico or, they're coming from Florida or they're coming from wherever. Who am I to say you don't have the right to move, especially if you're moving somewhere where they're welcoming you, where
exactly.
It's a landlord is saying, well, sure, you can be my tenant. I will gladly exchange in, free commerce with you. Well, who am I to step in and say you're not allowed to do this?
If we're voluntarist, if that's our philosophy, that everything should be a voluntary interaction, a voluntary exchange. If you have two people, like a perfect example you just gave, a landlord and a tenant, a prospective landlord and a prospective tenant. Yes, I will rent you this house for X number of dollars a month. Both sides agree to the transaction. How do you get a collective to insert themselves into that transaction and say, no, this transaction cannot happen? And, Chris and Wes, just to let you know, I did have some qualms about writing this book and exploring this subject. And at first I just did it as a personal exploration. I thought, I want to really read everything these guys wrote on this subject. I want to dissect it issue by issue, because these guys are smart and they haven't shown themselves to be collectivist in any other area. Maybe I'm missing something. And I actually hate there to be schisms within the libertarian community, because it seems easy to everybody be unified against statism and against the theft of taxation. It seems easy to be unified along those lines, that every interaction should be a voluntary interaction. So I really thought maybe I'm missing something here. And these guys are my friends that are taking the other side on this. I go out to eat with them. I talk to them. I meet with them. I write articles for their websites. And I hate to even bring them up by name, because I consider them to be good people. But an example, like you said, Donald Trump there, I was really taken aback by one of the, if not the most prominent libertarian podcasts. They were discussing Trump. And this comment was made by, people that are my friends saying, well, at least he's good on immigration, at least he's, because he has said that Mexicans are all murderers and rapists and we need to shut down the borders and build a big wall and, keep all the Muslims out as a collective action and not individuals making those decisions, because there's always going to be dissenters. There's always going to be individuals in, let's say, the United States that dissent from that idea of keeping everybody out because they want to invite somebody in to marry their daughter or to work for them or to be a tenant or to buy their land or something like that. So I was really taken aback by that this position, this Hoppian, Rothbardian position on immigration, only on immigration, they're against collective action and anything else, has actually resulted in some of those people championing Trump as saying like, well, he's bad on other things, but at least on immigration, he is good, that he would send the army down to the border and, shut off the border. And, even on a purely economic argument, that's a mistaken position, because the area I live on, the Mexican border, 60% of the winter produce, fruits and vegetables consumed in the entire United States comes across this border, because the United States is in a northern climate and they do not have a winter growing season. So 60% of the fruits and vegetables that are consumed in the entire United States that you buy in Walmart, Safeway, Winn-Dixie, Kroger, they come across the Mexican border through my town here, and that economic interaction in the border communities actually benefits the whole United States. So even as a purely economic action, you want to allow those voluntary interactions to happen. So I saw this as unprincipled, and that's why I wrote my book going, like I said, initially as a personal exploration, I went issue by issue, all the things that Rothbard uses, all the arguments that Hoppe uses to maintain this collective enforcement of immigration restrictions. I dissected those issue by issue, and my chapter headings are basically fallacies, the fallacy of this, the fallacy of that. So it's a very niche book, it's not going to have a broad market, but it's for those people who have seen the inconsistency within the libertarian community on the immigration issue.
Yeah, those fallacies are really interesting. I wonder, I see a parallel between the claims of your friends or arguments about Trump and that policy with the orthodox objectivists about national self-interest. When we scale up to collectivism in that realm, they somehow lose the ethics of individualism, and they just become full on into the realm of collectivism, trying to justify their views based on the existing nation state. It's almost like, I've heard this said a few times on the Freedomain Radio in that community, where they say, well, we don't have a free market yet. If we had a free market, then of course we could have open borders. But so long as we've got statism, we need to advocate, these pragmatic positions in order to somehow better our society. And what fallacy do you think that one goes under?
Well, under a couple of them, the main one it falls under, I have a chapter heading called The Group's Fallacy, and it addresses that issue. Like you say, the issues of the objectivists, the Keynesians, all the isms, fascism, communism, Nazism, Keynesianism. The fallacy of the objectivists is that you can, as a group, you could have a central planner that could add up the value to society of any action, any proposed action, any foregone action, any action that could be taken or would maybe not be taken, and that you could tabulate the benefit to society rather than looking at individual preferences and individual values and the subjective preferences of the individual. And I actually have another chapter that's called Reductio ad absurdum, which addresses what you just said right there, Chris. That, I think you could apply this to any area. If you want to say that a state distortion has caused a problem, so we need state action in another area to address that problem, you could use that for anything. For example, Hoppe says that state distortions have been caused by having state welfare, having state roads that are, public commons that are, unjust unjust appropriation of private land and put it into government usage, that you have all these state distortions, which are true. Those have state distortion. Those are state distortions that are caused by state action. So rather than just doing the principled proposal that let's get rid of all that stuff, let's get rid of welfare and public education because you think that maybe people have been attracted to this country, let's get rid of public roads, period. What they've done is proposed another state intervention in the realm of border guards to address the initial distortion in the economy that's been caused by the initial state intervention. But if you think about it, Chris, you could do that kind of you could do a little thought experiment in a bunch of different areas, and you could see how absurd that is. You could say, for example, that minimum wages have caused unemployment amongst unskilled laborers, unskilled laborers, that minimum wage has caused unemployment. And that is a state distortion. Okay, you could say, well, let's propose another state action called unemployment benefits so that we can try to make things a little bit better in this area that has been distorted by another state action called minimum wage laws. Well, why not just cut to the chase and say, let's get rid of minimum wage laws instead of proposing another distortion? Let me give you another one. I have this one in the book in my chapter called Reductio ad absurdums. And what a reductio ad absurdum is, where you propose a philosophical, a little thought experiment to just point out the absurdity of the position that you're opposing. I have this one in the book as just an absurd idea. Like, let's say that you think that the welfare state has resulted in more down and out drug addicts because now they're using their welfare money, they're diverting that, and they're buying drugs with it. So let's say that you say the welfare state has caused there to be more drug addicts and less productive people in society. So what you could propose as a response to that, let's have a drug war. Let's have a DEA. Let's have a national drug war because the welfare state has caused a distortion in the economy where more people are now addicted to drugs. So rather than just saying the principled response, which is let's get rid of the welfare state, it makes no sense to me if you're a principled libertarian to say, okay, this state action has caused a distortion in the economy, so now let's propose an additional state action, a drug war, to get rid of that problem that was caused by the initial state action. And how that relates back to what we're saying is, Chris, if you're saying that the welfare state and public education and public health programs have created an incentive for people to come to this country, rather than saying let's use the theft of taxation, all tax is theft, let's use the theft of taxation to hire Border Patrol agents to keep those people from coming in. Like you're proposing another state program because the initial state program caused a distortion in the economy. Why not just say let's get rid of the other state programs that are causing the economy, like public education and public welfare programs?
Yeah, rather than dealing with the derivative issues. It is very unfortunate, but it's so popular to use these arguments to try to do damage control of the ills of statism. And, Chris, we talked about in the last show on the gene wars we did with Kevin McKernan, we talked about how Stef mentioned that you need to initiate some force to prevent the immigrants from coming in that would initiate far more force through the welfare state, So this is the kind of convoluted reasoning that you run into when you just forget about the principles of liberty. And it's terribly unfortunate. But he did say, Stefan said that immigration is a government program. So if you advocate open borders or if you advocate for immigration, you're advocating for a government program, which of course overlooks all the other aspects of that government program, which is all the border patrol and, harming people, deporting them, delaying them. I got detained for 6 hours at the border, actually 12 miles north of the border. I was in California. I wasn't even trying to cross the border, but my friend was from Indonesia, and when she said that, she had a student visa, but she didn't take it with her because we weren't going to cross the border that day. We were just going to take some pictures of wildflowers.
I have that happen to me all the time. Like I'm a big, tall, white guy. I'm 6 feet 4 inches. I'm a white guy. I speak English. I have Arizona plates on my car. Nothing Hispanic looking at all about that picture, but I get pulled over all the time, and I get interrogated and detained by the side of the road, and I'm not even adversarial with these guys. I say, look, I have the right to remain silent, but I don't quote constitutional law to them, but they will detain me by the side of the road, and they have told me this. They have said, look, we have the right within 100 miles of the international border to detain anybody we want with no cause. And I have told them, look, there are a little over 300 million people in the United States, and 200 million of those people, 2/3 of those people, live within 100 miles of the international border. So you're claiming that you need no probable cause to pull over and detain 2/3 of all Americans on no cause because they live within 100 miles of the border. But yeah, sorry for interrupting you there, but that just prompted that thought in my head.
What happens when you try to go on your way without obeying their directives?
Well,
you can get shot.
Yeah, that's exactly right. And I always ask them, and they take affront. I always say, "Are you detaining me? Am I free to go?" And by the fact of me asking that raises their ire, that raises their hackles, and they will then detain me. In this area, they have a policy of a maximum of 30 minutes for a roadside detention if they haven't come up with another reason within that period of time. So what they'll do is they'll detain me for like 29 minutes by the side of the road. And I'm being polite the whole time, and they're trying to interrogate me about where I'm going. And my standard answer is, well, I'm just going about my business. And then if they probe further, I say, well, I have the right to remain silent. And then they'll say, well, sir, you're not being arrested for anything. So this right to remain silent isn't really an issue here because you're not being arrested. I go, well, as a free citizen, I can just choose to not talk, and I choose to not answer questions. And they take offense to that, and they'll typically use their local policy of detaining me for the maximum of a half an hour just because I'm not fully bearing my soul to them about all my family history and my plans for the day and where I've been, and then I'm on the way.
Yeah, the most intrusive questions. I got that coming across the border from Ottawa, Canada into New York. I was detained there, and my truck was subjected to a random search, random in quotes, right? So did they bring out the drug-sniffing dogs? Do they do that a lot? Or, the Mexican-sniffing dogs, supposedly?
Yeah, they can if they're close enough to their station, or they'll use the full half hour to act like they're calling in a dog, to run a dog on the car. And, oftentimes, it's not close enough to their station for a canine unit to arrive within that amount of time. But, of course, that's an entire fraud, too. I worked a career in federal law enforcement. I ran whole...
You've been in the belly of the beast.
Yeah, I read whole offices of the DEA. For this whole section of the border, I actually ran the office of the DEA with subordinate supervisors underneath me, and I've seen the ability for the canine officer to just tap the spot of the car where he wants the dog to alert on, and then claim that he has an alert. And you can't impeach that dog's testimony. You can't put him on the witness stand and have him grilled by a defense attorney of like, what do you mean, you detected drugs? It's just kind of a plausible deniability that, oh, yeah, the dog said there's drugs and I'm his trainer and we have these magic signals that we do. So therefore, it's a good hit and I can search your car. So,
as Mark Stevens says, you'd be off in the adventures of legal land at that point, exactly. The statist system.
And, like you said, when you're referring to Stefan Molyneux and these other people saying that, if we have open immigration, this is the invitation towards bigger statism. So, and what they're basically saying is that closed borders is the default position for any logical person, anybody in this country, any individual. That the default position is closed borders, and therefore we're going to speak on your behalf as the federal government and say, well, you wouldn't want just anybody coming into your house, and so we're just going to deny you the ability to invite any particular person onto your land or to exclude anybody from your land. We're just going to proclaim for you on your behalf as a collective that your default position should be closed borders around the entire country. But another thing I point out in my book is Hans Hermann Hoppe wrote a great book called Democracy, the God That Failed, saying that collectives can never have a collective voice. You can never poll the people or get the people to vote through the democratic process and ascertain what direction the collective should go. And why is that? Because you can never get unanimous consent from everybody. You could never get 300 million people in the United States to unanimously express their will that we should shut the borders down and not let people in that they want to come in. So if it's not unanimous, if you can't get every American to agree on that policy through voting or through democracy or something, and you never could, but if you can't get a unanimous declaration by everybody in the country to keep people out, let's say Mexicans, to keep Mexicans out, then you're subverting the will of some individuals in the United States who are, quote here, quote, legitimately in the United States, that they are having their will subverted to the collective. And in Hoppe's great book, he has said that, it's never just to subvert the will of the individual just because the collective votes to do something that they think would in its benefit. Even if the majority voted, even if 60% or 70% of people said, yeah, let's have a big wall and let's keep all Mexicans out of the United States. Well, you have 30% of individuals who don't agree with that, and they're having their rights trampled and their personal will is being subverted by the collective. And I don't know why Hans Hermann Hoppe can see that fallacy when he's talking about any other subject. He can see the fallacy of a group taking action that subverts the individual. He can see how that's wrong, except on the issue of immigration.
Yeah, it becomes really emotional, doesn't it? And the fear gets activated. I was listening to an interview that Leo Laporte did on triangulation with Jonathan Haidt. He's a social psychologist, does a lot of interesting analysis of liberal and conservative mindsets and so forth. And they were talking about supporters of Trump. And there was a recent article written where they said what distinguishes those folks is this authoritarian mindset that gets activated when there's this in-group, out-group fear response that happens. And whether that's all the parts of the puzzle is well, a question.
I think that's part of it. And let me kind of raise another aspect of what Hoppe says that kind of points out that aspect of it. When he addresses the divide, the schism within the libertarian community on this issue, what Hoppe says repeatedly is that it's left libertarians that he also refers to as bleeding heart libertarians that take the wrong position on this issue. So he's basically suggesting what you're saying, like that, there's this more common sense authoritarian aspect that would come from another wing of the libertarian community. But in my book, I address that fallacy and I say, look, what about people on the right that are private property owners and that don't want some collective group, some national entity speaking on their behalf? What if they say, hey, I want to trade with who I want to trade with. I want to hire who I want to hire. I want to rent apartments to whoever I want to rent apartments to. I don't need you speaking on my behalf. And the biggest mistake that leftists in general make, and maybe some left libertarians make this mistake too. What's the biggest mistake they make? They make the mistake of saying that all property should be shared property, or a lot of the property in the community should be shared property. And so that's a collectivist fallacy. And what Hoppe is doing, he is making that same mistake. He is making the same collectivist mistake of saying that we should have the ability to have a shared group collectivist control over everybody's property. He's actually making the mistake that he attributes to left libertarians by saying that a collective should be able to speak for everybody and exclude people from coming on your land, although he blames left libertarians for being the ones in the libertarian community who would actually be in favor of open borders. And I point out how that's a mistaken position, how you're actually preventing people on the right from having people onto their land that they want to have onto their land. You're speaking for them. You're imposing a collective on them to prevent them from associating freely with whoever they want to associate with. And they may even be on the right end of the political spectrum, on the right, the right-wing spectrum.
Yeah, contrary to popular libertarian belief, we can't get to a society of freedom through any aspects of statism. So exactly. That's an important lesson to learn.
Right. So, David, when you're out and you're talking to people about these points you have, these fallacies, and I'm wondering what feedback you're getting, or what feedback are you getting from people who have read the book?
Actually, from every libertarian that talks to me in person, face to face, nothing being recorded or anything, they're all very supportive of this, and they're all very agreeable to it. The ones that avoid this issue, there's people who will do national level libertarian podcasts on basically any random issue that you can think of. But the ones that have friends within the Austrian economics community, they don't want to express an opinion because they don't want to offend their mentors, like Hoppe, and of course Rothbard has passed away now, but there are still people alive now that are pillars of the libertarian community who take the hard line on anything that Hoppe said, anything that Rothbard said, which for most part they're correct on everything, on the criticism of objective versus subjective, valuations and personal preferences and all that. But there's a lot of people who won't touch this, not because they disagree with me, but they don't want to offend the pillars of the community of Austrian economics. And by the way, not all Austrian economists take the Rothbardian and Hoppian side on this. There's a whole lot of them that take our side on this issue. As a matter of fact, if you don't mind, if I digress a little bit here, and I'll quote Robert Higgs. He's an Austrian economist, and he lives currently in Mexico on the Yucatan Peninsula. And he sees these guys as being totally on the wrong side. The Hoppian position is totally on the wrong side. And let me just quote a little bit from him. This is from a Facebook post he did. There are people who oppose almost everything about the state. They oppose its taxing, its spending, its borrowing, its employment of clerks and bureaucrats, its central bank, its police, its military forces, its economic interventions, its social regulations, its scientific research, its public health activities, its space exploration, marine search and rescue activities, public water supply and sewer systems, its building and maintaining of public tennis courts. However, notwithstanding that they apparently despise every aspect of the state, they do favor the state's use of violence against Jose and Maria, the former seeking work as a strawberry picker and the latter hoping to get a job making beds in a hotel in the event that these, quote, aliens try to cross the state's border without the state's approval. From the foregoing facts, are you inclined to believe anything in particular about these almost, but not quite, anarchists?
Yeah.
Sure leads you to speculate on the motivations behind it.
Yeah, I mean, he kind of leaves the door open there to kind of like look for other, motivations. And I'm not going to say that these guys have, I don't know if they have other personal disfavor for certain groups of people or something like that. I'm trying to stick with the quantifiable things that they say, their stated reasons for their positions, because they try to couch it all in terms of property rights and whatnot. So I'm trying to dissect this issue based on what they say, not trying to infer that they have some dark motives that we can't discern.
Well, there is a fair amount of bigotry that's coming out of the Trump supporting, campaign. And this is just a part of the fascist stuff. Fascism is about really slicing and dicing groups of people. And hopefully you're in the majority or the plurality that's in charge. And, whenever fear and anger is activated, empathy kind of goes out the window. It's just not there anymore. So, Chris, when Molyneux said that immigration is a government program, I guess he's speaking of the welfare that's given to like refugees, that they're transported, or even they're even transported over here sometimes. I'm not sure how they handle the deportation, if government tax dollars pay for that or what, or the other government gets the bill for their subcitizen. But as far as I know, the lion's share of the immigrants, the people that move, or just migrant workers that come to America, are exchanging in voluntary trade in business. No one is forcing the landlord to keep them renting. They're paying rent, they're working their jobs, they're engaging in voluntary interactions. The only part that's not voluntary are the gatekeepers that are preventing them from coming and going. That's
so true. And I get tired of getting blamed for, As if you and I would support the idea of the government paying for refugees to come from Europe or the Middle East using taxpayer theft appropriated funds to pay for people to come here to, transport them here. But we get accused for having that position, and I've never had that position. You don't have.
It's a package deal, though. It really is a package deal, because when the gatekeepers are in charge of allowing you to come in the country, so they could dictate the terms by which you come in, and then they would pay for it or not, right? But if there were open borders among property owners, I would guess it'd be very easy to get transportation to a place that you want to go to.
Right. Like Hoppe suggests that there's too many roads in the United States because the government builds roads. And then he's basically implying that there's certain areas in the United States that would be inaccessible, even though there would be a property owner there that wants to rent property to, let's say, a Guatemalan. He wants to. He has a prospective tenant, but that just the property would be inaccessible. So he's kind of making like the inverse roads argument of saying like the market would not build enough roads on its own because the state is overbuilding roads that they have created access to areas where people otherwise would not have access. And I think that's a ludicrous argument to say that the free market wouldn't create natural access points if an individual property owner wants to rent his land to somebody and he has, it's a willing voluntary transaction, to just say he would be stymied by the market. If the government didn't build those roads, those people wouldn't be able to get to his property. When, we know that private property owners that benefit from drive-by traffic so they can sell them cheeseburgers or rent them a hotel room, that private property owners cooperate to provide easements across their land to facilitate traffic between them and their neighbors, and to get people to come utilize their resources and to patronize their businesses. So I think that's kind of a ludicrous argument to say that the free market would not be able to solve that problem of creating enough roads to allow people from, let's call them outsiders or foreigners, to allow them to come do a voluntary transaction with somebody in the United States if the government wasn't building the roads.
Yeah, it's about win-win, respectful interactions. And the more there's freedom, the more respect there is and responsibility for the freedoms that you have.
Correct.
Well, I mean, people are used to black and white thinking. I've seen criticisms of the shows me and Wes have done where they're like, oh, don't listen to these liberals.
Liberals. Great.
Yes. Because clearly if we're against Trump,
you got to be for Hillary, right? Or Bernie?
Yeah, we must be Democrats.
Yeah, I've heard, on various shows like Free Talk Live and other, libertarian shows, if anyone takes the position, let's say like Ian Freeman or somebody, a host on Free Talk Live, if he takes the position that, hey, don't interfere with me interacting with whoever I want to interact with, if I want to do business with somebody, and they'll accuse him of being a statist and wanting to utilize state resources, and that he would want to pay for refugees coming in, and you're a bleeding heart liberal and all this. And he's like, no, wait a minute. I'm against all that stuff. I'm against the government paying to import people into this country. But if it's a private transaction and somebody is, paying their own way to interact with somebody else, that's either internal to their own country or to a neighboring country, that's assuming that the concept of nations have any legitimacy in the first place once the state gets out of it. At this point, nations are just collective tax farms. They're just tax livestock, where we have a fence around you and we have the right to plunder you. You're our farm animals and we can, plunder tax money from you. But yeah, you get accused of being a statist, that you're supporting the idea of these people being funded to come in here. No, I'm totally against anything like that. Any, state action, like that, of paying for anybody to come in here, to relocate anybody, or to give them, food stamps or, state-funded welfare benefits once they get here. I'm against all that. Don't call me a leftist or a left libertarian or anything like that. I'm against any state program. But they'll do that. You're right. Like based on this podcast, somebody will call us, a leftist, or, that we're a proponent of statism.
Yeah, it's hard to think outside the state's box sometimes. We live with the religion of politics, essentially. And it's the predominant one of our age, unfortunately. But there's also the cultural side, and I notice you have the cultural destruction fallacy and the homogeneous society fallacy. Those things, I think, are promoted heavily by Freedomain Radio. Right, Chris?
Yeah, we're living in the Freedom Club here, and if we let these Mexicans and Muslims in, then the glorious Freedom Club will be destroyed. It will be forever tarnished.
And supposedly there's evidence or research that shows that sort of monocultural or, just one ethnicity sort of societies are better in some respects. I haven't looked at the nature of that research because it seems so collectivistic and fallacious.
Well, Hoppe goes very heavily into that, how the societies would gravitate towards a homogeneous society, and he builds his case about how Western societies and male-dominated societies, how they have resulted in good things for mankind. And then he talks about that a lot. And then he says, so therefore, people would naturally want to have more productive individuals within the society, so therefore they would invite these type of people in and exclude these other type of people. And then the other inverse argument that they use is called a cultural destruction argument, that these other types of people that don't have our same cultural roots, that they will come in and destroy the fabric of society. And, like you say, the voting blocks would change. But what's really interesting is, he veers away from a principled economic argument. And when they start talking about cultural destruction, they're grasping at straws to support this position, because you basically have a situation. Let's say there's a northern European country. And people like Hoppe and Rothbard would like there to be a collective border control where you couldn't immigrate to those countries unless you surpass certain hurdles. But the funny thing is, there are individuals in those countries, business owners, who want to invite people in because it's they want the skills that those people have, or they're a cheaper source of labor, or they want to rent a house to that person, and they have to subvert the will of individuals within that country in order to create a national collective. So I have a chapter called Grasping at Straws, because this is not a cohesive collection of arguments that results in everything else that Hoppe writes and Rothbard writes, they deal in what's called praxeology, human action, praxeology, and a priori truths and axiomatic principles. They start with axioms, and then they have a priori truths that are undeniable truths, and they build through praxeology. It's kind of like doing a very logical mathematical equation to come out with a result. But in this case, they don't have that, so they have this weird mix of of disjointed arguments that are these things like cultural destruction and the homogeneous society fallacy, and blaming left libertarians. And it's a weird hodgepodge. Another thing, interesting one that Hoppe gets into is, since he realizes that the collective would be unjust and unenforceable without something like democracy, he goes into this weird thought experiments, the example of a monarch, of a king. And he said, well, since people would have their different wills within society, but you want national border controls, you want to shut down the entire border, but people will have their own individual wills against that. If you had a king, in the old days when a king owned the whole territory, it didn't matter what his subjects thought. It didn't matter what the people think that live in that country. He could make a decision that would benefit himself, because he's the property owner. Everybody is his tenant. He owns immense territory, and they're all his tenants, so it doesn't matter what they think. And then from that, he tries to develop a corollary from that to say, therefore, the President of the United States, a democratically elected leader of a state government, he should act like a monarch and make decisions as if he is the landowner of the whole country that would benefit the whole country, and basically subvert the will of individuals to benefit the whole country as a whole by prohibiting certain people like Mexicans or Guatemalans or whatever from that you decide are undesirables for whatever reason. You're going to prevent the people in your country from dealing with those people. Why? Because you are a democratic elected leader. You are Obama, but you're going to adopt the mindset of a monarch. And this is what he says, and this thought experiment that he does as a monarch. You're going to adopt the mindset of a monarch that will treat the country as his own personal property, and he will overrule the personal preferences of everybody in that country who wants to trade with outsiders, and that this would result in benefit for the country. And it's like, man, it's just like kind of weird going off in la la land to propose something like that from a guy who is so logical. Hoppe is so logical in every other area. He's against the state, and he proves it point by point, logically, with axiomatic principles and a priori building blocks using praxeology to prove that collectivism is bad in every other area. But on this one here, he just goes to endless lengths to try to justify the collective.
Yeah, that reeks of megalomania, that argument, to have the leader just dominate as if it's his own property. I guess Bush had that nailed with being the decider, huh? But lots of checks and balances in the present system, of course. It's an open question whether Trump's sort of zeal to do all these things will be able to be done given those checks and balances. But we know we're still going to have statism no matter who wins the election. So it's a matter of getting to these first principles, and I really appreciate that you've grokked this and really looked at it through this subjective lens of understanding these principles of liberty, because it's so seldom that people do this, right?
Yeah. Do you mind if I just do little anecdotal commentaries about my community that I live in here? This is kind of straying from the logical foundation of my book, but I live in a border town. And I see this endless parade of politicians coming down to the border fence and gesturing towards Mexico and doing all this scaremongering and fearmongering about how out of control it is here. But what's really funny is the crime statistics here in this border town that I live in, Nogales, where it's my hometown. The crime statistics are lower than the entire state of Arizona. They're lower than the big cities that are not on the border, like Tucson and Phoenix, the two big cities in Arizona. The crime statistics are lower here than in those places. People leave the doors open to their houses, very family-oriented community, very, very loving people that live in this community. And people here are offended by the fact that people point their fingers at the border. People like Trump and these national level politicians and the national level media saying, "Oh, everything's so out of control on the border," and yet they won't even look at their own, FBI crime statistics that are staring them in the face. That just from the year that just ended, 2015, saying this is safer than the average crime rate in Arizona and safer than the big cities where all these fearmongers reside, like the state legislature in Arizona is in Phoenix, which is far from the border. And they up there have a bunch of border fearmongers that just assume it's out of control here. But just a little anecdotal evidence that it is not out of control, and it is not like people think. And when people hear I'm from the border, they start talking in hushed tones and they start whispering, "Tell me how bad it is. Give me the inside scoop. Do you have
you seen a beheading?
Yeah. Do you have all these, terrorism and this kind of stuff?" And the people are really offended by that here, that it drives away people who would do business here or who would choose to live here, that it's very safe here and safer than the rest of the state. But anyway, that's just a little an anecdotal detour from what we're talking about.
And a lot of the fear-mongering about the criminality is probably, it originates from the drug war that the U.S. has been pressing here as well as in Mexico.
Yeah, that's exactly right. Like, I have firsthand experience on that. Like, here in Arizona where I live, if you look at a ranking of gun rights for the 50 states, Arizona has the number one ranking for the best preserved gun rights, the most gun freedom here of all 50 states, and we have very low crime rate here. And also, this is one of the states that's adopted a form of drug legalization, partial legalization of marijuana. Now, let's look at what you have in Mexico, where there is more violence. You have two things that don't mix. You have outright drug prohibition, and you have prohibition on the ownership of firearms, and those things just do not go well together. Like, we've already learned this lesson in the U.S. in the 1920s and the 1930s about substance prohibition. Yeah, like when they tried to prohibit alcohol in the U.S., there was a big spike in violence, gangs fighting with each other, gangs fighting with the police, because you drove this trade into the underground economy. People still wanted it. Americans still wanted it, but you made it go underground. And people finally woke up and realized that, wait a minute, this is causing more violence by doing this. But in Mexico, you have those two things that don't mix. It's like oil and water don't mix. You have drug prohibition, and then you won't let people defend themselves. And so then you have the violence within the criminal gangs that don't care about the laws, and then the people that do care about the laws down there, they will disarm themselves. So that's the problem in Mexico, exactly like you said, is drug prohibition, and then the thing that compounds that and exponentially makes it worse is they try to keep the people from arming themselves, which would, put down a lot of the violence. Yeah,
I attended a Libertarian meeting here a few years ago. This guy came up from Mexico and talked about that very issue. Like, if you allowed citizens or just the residents down in Mexico to actually have firearms to defend themselves, a lot of that criminality could be nipped in the bud. And of course, there's lots of other aspects culturally that probably would need to be addressed as well. But that's a really important thing as far as self-defense goes.
Exactly.
So, David, I'm wondering, you gave an anecdotal example of the crime statistics and the like. In your book, do you spend much time building a case against some of the myths about immigration that are put forth by people like Donald Trump? Or do you just stick strictly to the principles?
Well, this is such a niche book. I didn't try to make it really be a history of immigration and how it has evolved and whatnot. It was really my personal reaction and personal exploration of the divide within the libertarian community, and specifically the ones that have sparked the pro-nation state reaction, which is the Rothbardian, Hoppian contingent, to go ahead and just read in an open-minded fashion everything they wrote and every supporting argument and everything that anyone else has written about that, and actually dissect those fallacies point by point. So that's mainly what my book does, is dissect those Hoppian fallacies, so that any libertarian who is rubbed the wrong way, where this just doesn't feel right to them, this doesn't make sense, they could have a resource to go to look at that. So it is a niche book. It doesn't really address on the broad front immigration issues, but I do mention Donald Trump a couple of times in the book, and the type of things that he says and how that's going to result in a bigger police state. And something I experience down here all the time, in the Western United States in general, is a vast growth of the police state. And some of that has been caused from the drug war, but a lot of it has been caused from this immigration enforcement. Like the biggest Border Patrol office in the whole country is right here in the town where I'm from, Nogales, Arizona. So what has that resulted in? They dwarf the local law enforcement officers, and since they have adopted this position, they're the 800-pound gorilla in the community. They've adopted the position that they can pull anybody over for any reason. So guess what all the other law enforcement agencies are doing, like the Highway Patrol and the Sheriff's Office and the police departments? It's kind of like, well, the Constitution has been thrown out the window by the feds, so now everybody else just pulls you over. It's just, assumed prima facie that all law enforcement has the ability to pull anybody over for anything, and everybody's now dressed like they're fighting some war in the Middle East. They all have their armor and their BDU uniforms and their armored vehicles, no matter if they're a local officer or if the federal law enforcement agency. So what it's done in the Western states, it has really eroded our freedoms. It's turning into a police state where the Constitution's been thrown out the window, and now I'm afraid people in the interior of the U.S. don't have that perception that this whole immigration issue is gonna accelerate the U.S. Turning into a police state.
Yeah, and just because these border guards or anyone that wears a costume and has a badge is seen as legitimate in our society doesn't mean that they're not committing criminal acts, essentially, like detaining people, kidnapping them, even killing them. This is the problem we have with statism, is that it somehow legitimizes criminal actions. People are, injured and killed by people that see themselves as protecting the rest of us. So this is part of the collectivistic paradigm that we're in, unfortunately. And in a system of private property rights, we would have justice agencies that would respect individual rights first and foremost. I mean, that's why they'd be in business. They wouldn't, as a routine, violate the rights of individuals, which is what happens at these border situations.
Right.
Yeah, in the book you mentioned the biggest fallacy, the state head busting. I was kind of wondering what that was.
Well, it's almost something that shouldn't even have to be stated. Like if you support the opposite side of this immigration issue, the side that we're not on, but the other side, what you're basically, it's just so obvious. I thought, well, I shouldn't even have to say this, but I'm going to say it anyway. Of all the atrocities that that would result from statism and promoting more border guards and more stops where there's no probable cause for the stops, and more roadside detentions and more shootings and more the boot on your neck, like people detaining you and saying you haven't done anything wrong, but you can't leave because I'm still just digging around through your car to see if I can find something to arrest you for. That it's the violence of the state. You are asking for that, and it just seems like. And I give a bunch of examples of the violence that comes when you ask for an increased police state. And it should be so obvious that you don't have to say that. And it doesn't really relate directly to the logical arguments I am making to dissect Hoppe's position on the immigration issue. But I kind of digressed in that chapter just to say, look, if you're a libertarian and you're calling for more statism to enforce immigration, you're basically asking for people to pull you over and shoot you and detain you and handcuff you, and just realize what you're asking for.
Right. Yeah, that's a great point to go ahead and close it up. David, thank you so much for joining us. Wes, it's been great to have you back.
Thanks.
David, if anyone wants to buy the book or get a hold of you, what would be the best way to do that?
Well, the best way is to go to Amazon. On the Amazon pricing structure, I made it as low as possible where I don't make any money on it, because I really wanted to just get the argument out there to refute these fallacies for people who are interested in it. And so I set the price as low as it could be. I think it's $3.60 with free shipping on Amazon Prime, and then there's the Kindle version out there as well. I'm going to try to put out a totally free version when I'm out from under the constraints of my contract with Amazon, the self-publishing, the Create Space contract, and probably try to put out an audiobook version on YouTube that people could just listen to for free as they're driving down the road. But
nice.
The only way to get it now is Amazon, either Kindle and or the print version, and I have them set as low as they'll allow me to do to cover their publishing cost, which I think is 99 cents maybe for the Kindle and $3.60 for the print version.
Very cool.
Fantastic.
Thanks for meeting the need for consistency in this realm. It is really, really needed, and really appreciate your transition to full-on voluntarism and upholding these principles that matter so much and that will hopefully get us to a future of freedom.
Well, thank you, guys, and I really appreciate talking to you, Chris and Wes. Great talking to you.
All right. And Wes, if you want to give your website real quick before we go.
Sure, CompleteLiberty.com. And the episode where I talked about my time at the border there was actually back in 2009, and it's episode 63 of Complete Liberty Podcast.
And if I can do another plug here, if you go to LouRockwell.com and search for my name, I've written a lot of articles on that website if people want to read for free more things I've written.
Nice.
Sounds good. All right, I'll put some links in the show notes to all of that. All right, gentlemen, take care.
Okay, thanks.
rises, I enter the land, waited for so many years. Summer solstice, the flame is alive, divine power built I give you.